In the last few seconds of the countdown to the world's first atomic bomb test in 1945, many of the people there didn't know if it was going to even work. Even General Groves, who had directed the Manhattan Project, said as he lay on the ground facing away from a test, he was thinking what he would do when the timer hit zero and nothing happened. But of course, as we know, it did work and the world was changed forever, but the US wasn't the only country to have a nuclear weapons program. In fact, 5 countries active in World War II had nuclear programs, and all were working to make their own nuclear weapons. From little acorns great oak trees grow, and in the case of the atomic bomb, from subatomic particles untold destructive power comes. However, like many things, the end result was a world away from the initial research by a small group of international scientists into the newly discovered effect of radiation in the later years of 19th century. It was this international nature of the work with scientists from France, Denmark, Germany, Hungary, Soviet Union, Britain, United States, and Japan that would spawn nuclear programs in different countries around the world. In just over 40 years, we had gone from the discovery of radiation to the theoretical workings for an atomic bomb. But putting theories practice was a very different proposition. The practical creation of a sustained chain reaction was the goal in the controlled form as a nuclear reactor and the uncontrolled one as an atomic bomb, and both needed a material that would be fissile. In 1939, the only known material that could do this was uranium-235, but the problem was just getting hold of enough of it. 99% of all the uranium found on Earth is uranium-238, but it's too stable and won't create a self-sustaining chain reaction. For every 1 kilogram of uranium-238, there is around 0.7 grams of uranium-235 in with it. And whilst it can be separated from the uranium-238, the process is very difficult and time-consuming. In 1939, with Nazi Germany's annexation of Czechoslovakia, a worrying development was being noticed by the scientists working in the US and Britain, and that the sale of uranium ore from the now Nazi-controlled Czechoslovakia had been stopped and the purchase of heavy water from Norway had increased. Also in 1939, German nuclear physicist Siegfried Fluke published 2 influential articles on the exploitation of nuclear energy as a source of power. Though at the time, they thought that such a bomb would be too large to be carried by a plane and instead would be delivered via boats along a river or to maybe a port. 2 German refugee scientists, Rudolf Piles and Otto Fresh, who hadn't been allowed to work on the radar project because they were enemy aliens and didn't have clearance, were tasked by Professor Mark Oliphant at the University of Birmingham to investigate the chain reaction problem. They worked out that the critical mass, that's the amount of nuclear material required to achieve a sustained chain reaction in a sphere of pure uranium-235, could be as low as 1 to 10 kilograms. This meant that a bomb could be made small enough to be dropped from a plane and have the explosive power of 1,000 tons of TNT. The paper that Frisch and Piles wrote was called Memorandum on the Properties of a Radioactive Super Bomb, but it became known as Frisch and Piles Memorandum. For the first time, this not only set out what was needed to make an atomic bomb but also what the effects of having and using them would be. It pointed out the effects of a nuclear blast and the radio to fall out on civilians as well as combatants, and that if the enemy were to have atomic weapons, there would be virtually no defense against them. This prompted the British government to create the Moord Committee in 1940 to study nuclear power and the creation of the Tube Alloys Project to make their own atomic bomb. The upshot of this was that the creation of a working uranium bomb was not only thought possible, but it could be done in a couple of years. But by the summer of 1940, Britain was under daily air attack from the Luftwaffe and resources were scarce. The Americans were surprised by just how far the British had proceeded with the research, as most of their research was into nuclear reactors and not weapons. This, along with a lot of cajoling by Mark Oliphant, whom had shown them the Fresh and Piles Memorandum, and later from Churchill, spurred them in creating the Manhattan Project in October 1941. But the German atomic bomb project, which had been of concern to the US and British, wasn't faring quite so well, even though it had been German scientists, Otto Hahn and Fritz Strassmann, but had discovered nuclear fission in 1938, and German physicists such as Werner Heisenberg and Carl Friedrich von Weizsäcker were regarded as leaders in their field. Many believed that Germany not only had the brains, but with the occupation of Europe the means to develop an atomic bomb first. This forced out many of the top scientists that would later end up working in Britain and the US and on the Manhattan Project itself. Because many of the scientists were Jewish, areas of nuclear physics like quantum mechanics were seen as Jewish science and were denounced by the Reich. Something which they later would acknowledge in 1943 as having a major impact on their abilities, but by then, it was far too late. Attacks on the Norwegian heavy water facilities, which were now in the hands of German slowed research, was being done. And by 1942, it was assessed by the Reich that nuclear fission would not have a significant enough effect on ending the war. After the war, German scientists said that the lack of heavy water was a major in limiting their atomic program. It's the ability of this extra deuterium to slow down neutrons which made it of such great value. Uranium-235 can be triggered into a self-sustaining chain reaction if it is bombarded with slow-moving thermal neutrons. The heavy water works as a moderator to slow down fast neutrons without absorbing them like normal water does, and thus enables nuclear reactor to work. And a working reactor would be needed for research into how to build an atomic bomb. Now, what's not known by many is the Japanese also had an atomic bomb program. This was headed up by Yoshio Nishina, who had studied under Niels Bohr in Denmark in the 1930s. This program was called the Nigo Project and was under command of the Imperial Japanese Army. Although they worked on uranium refinement, they did little work on the actual bomb design itself. After Japanese Navy had conducted its own research with help from the Imperial University in Tokyo, it was concluded that one atomic bomb was theoretically possible and that the US was probably working on 12. They believed that it would be too difficult, even for the US to make a bomb within the time scale of the war. The Japanese Army continued its research into the Nigo project but only managed to make a small amount of material. But that was found not to be uranium-235, and the buildings where the work was carried out was also destroyed by fire after bombing raids by the US Air Force. Another issue that held the Japanese back was that they were working on their own and they didn't share information with their German allies, unlike the US, Britain, Canada, which worked together on the Manhattan Project. In the end, the lack of understanding about the project by the Japanese military leadership and the subsequent lack for the end of the war. Meanwhile, the Soviet scientific community had discussed the possibility of an atomic bomb through the 1930s. But it was only after the war started they created their own nuclear program. The Soviets suspected that both the Germans and the Allies were working on a super bomb. But with the German invasion of a Soviet Union, their nuclear research slowed to a crawl as many of their top scientists were drafted into the military. In 1940, Leonid Kovasnikov, a chemical engineer and NKVD operative, noticed that research about uranium was being pulled from Western publications, leading him to believe that there had been a breakthrough and they were working on a nuclear bomb. This information ended up on the desk of Laventry Beria, head of the NKVD, the Soviet secret police, but he didn't tell Stalin straight away as he knew he was preoccupied with the rest of the war. Various network spies also soon brought back information about the British breakthrough and the Fresh Piles Memorandum. In 1942, Georgy Flyer, of a prominent Russian physicist serving the Soviet Air Force, wrote to Stalin warning him about the development of atomic weapons by foreign powers, and that the first country to have an atomic bomb would dominate the rest of the world. Starling was fascinated by the thought of a superbomb and set up an atomic bomb project and put an inventory barrier in charge and told him he had 5 years to produce an atomic bomb or faced consequences. Whilst the rest of the Soviet Union suffered shortages of men, materials, and food, Beria set up a secret town and put in the top scientists to work on the atomic bomb with no expense spared. Beria had two lists, one for those who would get promotion for their work and the other for those that had failed. They would face the gulag or execution. Beria's use of spies to boost the Soviet bomb program with espionage. Like and subscribe my channel.